I had just stepped off the porch with an armful of kindling when I saw her, a figure slumped near my woodpile, barely moving, half buried in the snow. Her feet were bare, skin split and bleeding, her dress torn nearly to the hip. She didn't cry out, didn't beg, just lifted her head enough for our eyes to meet. That look held steady, as if she was waiting for me to decide which she'd see first, my hand or my back. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever stood at a crossroads where one choice could change everything. My name's Sear Ridge, and I've been keeping to myself out here for near 2 years now. I built this cabin with my own hands, pulling timbers down from the ridge and laying each board in place until I could shut out the wind. Folks in Dry Hollow know me from before the years when I worked the freighting lines, and before that wore Union blue. The war took my younger brother. The fever took the woman I was set to marry. And after that, I stopped thinking about starting over. I reckon I learned early that a man keeps what he can carry, and the rest the world finds a way to take. Life here is plain and measured. I keep a few traps in the basin, trade pelts for coffee and salt twice a season, and cut enough wood to see me through each winter. I've got no one to answer to, and no one looking for me. The land teaches a man to value his own company. I learned that same lesson growing up in Illinois. My folks worked a small spread raising hogs and corn, never owing a dollar they couldn't pay. My father believed in the Sabbath, my mother in feeding any traveler who came to the door, and both in working until your hands spoke for you. Things changed when I came west. The railroad brought men with more money than neighbors, and the speculators pushed on every boundary. Out here, a man's handshake still counts. But in town, it's paper and signatures that decide whether you keep your land or lose it. I've seen too many homesteads turned over to strangers by the stroke of a pen. Maybe that's part of why I keep my distance. Even so, winter has a way of pressing in, making the days too quiet. You notice every sound, the groan of the roof timbers, the pop of pine in the stove, the wind hunting for cracks in the chinking. That afternoon had been still the kind where snow muffles your own footsteps, and I thought the basin would stay that way until spring. I was wrong. I'd set down the kindling and taken 2 steps toward the pile when I realized it wasn't just wood stacked there. A shape lay crumpled against the drift, too still to be a neighbor's dog, too solid to be anything but human. I remember the way the cold caught in my lungs as I moved closer, slow and careful. Whoever she was, she'd come a long way without shoes, without coat, and without anyone to watch her back. I didn't know then what brought her here or what it would mean to carry her inside. All I knew was the sun was dropping fast, and if I left her there, the snow would take her before morning. I bent to lift her, and that was the moment the rest of my life began, though I wouldn't understand it until much later. Her weight was more than I expected when I slid my arms beneath her, one under her shoulders and the other beneath her knees. The cold had taken most of her warmth, and her skin felt near as hard as stone. I carried her inside boots, thudding against the plank floor, and laid her on the buffalo hide near the hearth. The fire had burned low, its glow faint against the dim corners. I tossed on 2 split logs and coaxed the flame until orange light pushed back the shadows. It spilled over her face, her dark hair clinging in loose strands to skin flushed from the wind. I found a clean cloth and warmed a tin of water on the stove. Kneeling beside her, I took one of her feet in my hand, turning it gently to see the damage. The skin was split in places, the soles raw and darkened from cold. But the frost hadn't bitten deep enough to kill the flesh. I cleaned each wound slow, the steam from the cloth curling between us. She winced once but kept still. Her eyes followed every movement, steady and unblinking, as if weighing what kind of man I was. When her feet were wrapped in cotton strips, I set the tin aside and ladled the last of the rabbit stew into a bowl. She took it without a word, eating slow, and even each spoonful deliberate. I watched from the cot the fire's heat settling into the room. Outside, the wind pressed hard against the walls, but in here it was only the crackle of pine and the faint sound of her swallowing. Morning came pale through the shutter slats. She was still wrapped in my coat, the collar pulled high. I ground coffee and set the kettle to heat. She sat up, the coat slipping from one shoulder to reveal a jagged scar running from her collarbone toward her back. I didn't stare, just took note. When I asked her name, she spoke for the first time, her voice low and dry, Tala. That was all she gave. By midday, I'd set a basin near the stove and filled it with hot water. I told her she could wash if she wanted, then stepped outside to give her the space. The wind had eased some, but the air still bit at the skin. I split wood until my arms ached, trying not to think too much about why she'd been out there barefoot in the snow. When I came back in, the basin was empty, and the shirt I'd left for her hung loose on her frame, the sleeves rolled above her wrists. She'd folded my coat neatly over the cot, as though it were something worth keeping. Her face was clean now, the tightness around her mouth eased. She stood by the stove, and in a voice stronger than before, she said, "I can cook." I nodded and let her. That evening, she moved about the room with a quiet purpose, stirring the stew and setting 2 plates without being told. We ate in silence, but it was a silence that felt less like strangers passing time, and more like 2 people sharing the same ground. Afterward, she settled on the buffalo hide near the hearth, while I sat at the table, the lamplight casting her shadow against the wall. At dawn the next day, I rose to find her still near the fire, wrapped in the quilt I'd given her. I stepped outside for the traps and brought back 2 rabbits. By the time I returned, she had already cleared the mugs, washed them, and hung my shirts to dry. She worked without hesitation, sleeves rolled, her hair pulled back in a tight braid. When I told her she didn't need to do all that, she only said, "I know," and kept on. We fell into a rhythm of sorts that day. I split logs while she stacked them, both of us moving without much talk. She was steady in her work, the kind of steady that comes from carrying weight long before winter made it harder. When the sled was full, we hauled it to the side of the cabin together, the snow creaking under our boots. That night, as I was settling into bed, she left her place by the fire and laid her quilt on the floor beside me. She didn't ask, and I didn't stop her. The snow fell heavier outside, quieting the basin, until the only sound was her breathing close to the bed. In the morning, I asked where she had been going. She said, "Nowhere." When I asked if she was running from someone, she shook her head, then added, "They let me go." It took a moment for her to finish. "A woman who cannot give a child is not wanted in my band." She didn't look away when she said it. There was no anger in her tone, no shame either, just a plain telling of the truth. I went to the cedar chest in the corner and took out a thicker flannel shirt and a pair of socks. Handing them to her, I said, "For you." She looked at them a moment before saying, "Thank you." It was the first time she had said those words since she arrived. Later, she followed me outside without my asking, pulling my coat over her shoulders. I gave her an old pair of work gloves, and she took up the stacking while I split the wood. The work went on for hours, the sun dipping low before we stopped. Neither of us spoke much, but the silence didn't feel empty. That night, she stayed closer to my bed again. The snow had stopped, and in the stillness, I found myself thinking less about the questions I hadn't asked and more about the fact that she was still here. And as the fire burned down to coals, I wondered just how long she meant to stay. By the 3rd morning, the basin had settled into a brittle stillness. Frost clung to the edges of the window panes, and the boards under my feet creaked sharp in the cold. Tala was already up, standing near the stove, with her sleeves rolled to the elbows, her hands moving steady over a pan of biscuits. The flannel shirt I'd given her hung loose on her frame. The socks rolled high to her knees. She didn't glance up when I came in from breaking ice in the water trough. I poured coffee and sat at the table watching her move. Each time she reached for the skillet, the scar on her shoulder caught the light. And though I'd never asked how she got it, I knew it wasn't from accident. She noticed me looking, but didn't turn away. After a while, she said quietly, "I was a wife once." The words landed with the same weight as the cast-iron lid she set aside. She told me she had been 16, her husband older, and after 3 winters without children, her people called her cursed and sent her away. I listened while she worked the sound of dough hitting the board between her sentences. When she finished speaking, she didn't wait for pity, just returned to the biscuits. I told her I had been close to marrying once, but fever took her before the spring. Tala only nodded, as if setting my words beside her own and leaving them there. The days turned in a slow rhythm. We shoveled snow from the path, carried in wood, and worked on the latch to the barn where the wind had warped the door. Her hands were rough but quick, holding a board in place while I hammered. In the evenings, she mended my shirts by lamplight, her brow bent in concentration, the thread pulling tight with each stitch. By the end of the week, I began to notice small changes. My coat stayed folded on the cot while she moved about the cabin without it. She walked outside to haul kindling or check the sled without asking if it was all right. And one night, she left the quilt she'd kept near the hearth and slid into the bed beside me, her body warm against my side. She said nothing at first, her hand resting light on my chest. Then she spoke low. "You gave me warmth and food and asked nothing back. If you want, I'll be your wife now." I didn't answer right away, but I drew her closer, the lamplight throwing our shadows long across the wall. She stayed there through the night, her breathing, even her head turned toward me. By morning, something in the cabin felt different, as if the quiet had taken on its own weight. The snow outside was heavy enough to muffle every step. I went about my work, checking traps and mending a fence rail where the last storm had pushed it loose. When I came back, she was kneading dough again, her braid pulled tight, sleeves pushed up. The smell of bread and coffee filled the air. We didn't speak much that day, but she stayed near, following me outside when I split logs. She took up the stacking without a word, her breath showing white in the air. The sun dropped behind the ridge, and the light turned the snow pale gold. That night, as we settled under the quilt, her head found its place on my shoulder as if it had always been there. The days ahead passed much the same. Tala worked beside me without hesitation, tending to the cabin as though it had always been hers. She never asked permission to make a change, and I never stopped her. The silence between us had shifted into something I didn't need to name. It was early one morning, the kind where the frost makes the boards groan, when she paused while sweeping near the stove. She looked toward the door as if listening for something. I heard only the wind moving over the basin, but her eyes stayed on that door a moment longer. Whatever she was thinking, she didn't share, and I didn't press. Later that day, I noticed her glance at the rifle propped by the door before stepping outside. She pulled on my coat and went to haul in the last of the split wood. I followed the snow crunching under my boots, the air sharp enough to sting. The basin lay wide and white around us, quiet but for the sound of our work. That evening we sat by the fire, the lamp turned low. She set her mending aside and looked across the room. "I'm staying," she said, her voice sure. I met her eyes, nodded once. There was no need for more words. I didn't know then what would come with that choice, but the way she said it left no room for doubt. Outside, the wind had fallen off the night, settling in with a kind of stillness that felt like the edge of something new. By late February, the cold had lost its sharpest edge, though the snow still lay thick over the basin. The days found a rhythm. Tala moved through the cabin with the ease of someone who knew where things belonged, not because she had asked, but because she had made them so. She mended shirts without a word, rearranged the shelves so I could find what I needed without thinking, and kept the fire fed while I worked outside. One morning I came in from the barn to find she had set the table with 2 tin plates. Not one. A pot of stew simmered on the stove, the air rich with the smell of venison and potatoes. She looked over her shoulder once, then went back to stirring. We ate without much talk, the sound of the spoon against the tin the only noise between us. Afterward, she pulled on my coat and followed me outside without asking. The snow creaked under our boots as we made our way to the woodpile. I split logs while she stacked them in the sled, her movements steady and sure. When the sled was full, we hauled it around the cabin together. She didn't flinch from the weight or the cold, and I didn't offer to take it from her. That night, she took her place beside me in the bed again, slipping under the quilt without a sound. Her body was warm against mine, her breathing slow. In the dark, she spoke just above a whisper. "I stayed because you didn't send me away." Her words hung there between us, and after a long moment she added, "I will stay because I choose to." The following week, I decided to make a trip into Dry Hollow for supplies. It had been months since I'd been there. I saddled the horse and told Tala I needed salt seed potatoes and nails. She asked why else I would go. I told her I wanted to bring back something proper for her to wear. She studied me a moment, then said she had never owned a dress that was hers alone. It was near midday when I reached town. The main street was quiet, only a few wagons tied along the hitching rail. I bought what I needed and stopped at the dressmaker's shop near the church. There I found a calico dress in a deep blue patterned with small white flowers. It wasn't fancy, but the stitching was good, and it would fit her frame. I returned before dusk. Tala met me outside, brushing her hands on her skirt. I handed her the wrapped bundle. She opened it slow, her fingers tracing the fabric before she looked up. "I've never had anything like this," she said, her voice low. That night she wore it. The firelight caught the curve of her waist, the way the skirt brushed her ankles. She crossed the room and placed my hand at her side. "I wear this because I know you want me here," she said. I told her I did. We stood there a long moment before she leaned in, her lips warm against mine. The rest of the night passed in quiet closeness, the kind that didn't need words. The wind pressed against the cabin walls, but inside the stillness felt different. By the next morning, she moved about in the blue dress as though she had always owned it. She tended the fire, rolled up her sleeves to knead dough, and hummed a tune I didn't know. I went out to check the fence lines, the sound of her voice carrying faintly through the open door. When I came back in, she was sweeping the floor, her braid hanging over one shoulder. She glanced at the rifle by the door, then at me. "You keep it loaded?" she asked. I nodded. She didn't say why she asked, and I didn't press, but I saw her eyes linger there before she turned back to her work. That evening, as the light faded over the ridge, she sat by the fire, sewing a patch onto the coat I'd first wrapped around her. Her stitches were even and sure, as if she meant it to last another lifetime. I sat at the table watching the flame throw shadows across the walls, wondering how quickly the quiet could change if trouble ever came to the basin. By early March, the snow had begun to sag away from the fence line, leaving dark soil showing in narrow strips. The air still held the bite of winter, but the wind no longer cut straight to the bone. The basin felt different, not just in the light, but in the way Tala moved through it. She no longer wrapped herself in my coat for every step outside. Some mornings I'd find her at the barn before me, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, carrying feed for the horses. One afternoon, while I was mending a section of roof where a limb had broken through, she came out with a basket of freshly washed shirts. She draped them over the line near the barn, her hands smoothing each sleeve before pinning it in place. I climbed down from the ladder to find her leaning against the fence, watching the far ridge. "I lied when I said no one followed me," she said without turning. Her voice was even, as if she'd been holding the words for the right time. She told me of 2 white men and a half-blood scout who had seen her leave the southern canyon. They'd tracked her for a day before she crossed the river and lost them. Traitors, she called them, the kind who take women when no one is looking. I set the hammer aside, stepping closer. "They won't come this far north," I said. She looked at me then, searching my face before nodding once. "I believe that." We went back to our work without more words, but I knew that something had shifted between us. That evening she cleared the table after supper, then spread an old scrap of cloth in the center. From it she lifted a ring made from twisted copper wire, polished smooth. "I found it in your tool chest," she said. "It wasn't finished." I remembered shaping it years back during a winter that seemed longer than most, then setting it aside. "I made it fit me," she went on, "because I belong here." I took the ring and slid it onto her finger, the metal warm from her hand. "I do," I said simply. She didn't smile wide or speak further, just leaned in to kiss me, slow and certain. Days turned longer with the change in season. We worked side by side, turning the soil in the garden plot, setting stones to mark the rows. Tala arranged the seedlings with care, humming under her breath as she worked. She never said what the tune was, and I never asked. Inside the cabin, her touch was everywhere. Blankets she'd stitched into the bedding shelves she'd ordered to her liking. Even a deer hide she'd tanned herself now lying under the table. One morning I saw her pause in the garden, her hand resting on her belly. I crossed the distance in a few steps. "What is it?" I asked. She met my eyes without hesitation. "I haven't bled in more than 5 weeks." I didn't speak right away, just held her hand and felt the stillness between us. "I've never made it this far before," she added. We didn't say more about it that day, but every time I looked her way, I noticed the small changes, the way she moved slower, the way her palm would settle against her stomach when she thought I wasn't watching. Later that week, a lone rider came into the basin. I was down by the creek, splitting a fallen limb, when I heard the hoofbeats. He was young alone and kept to the saddle when I stepped into view. "You Sir Ridge?" he asked. I nodded once. He said he'd passed an Apache woman months back near the southern canyon barefoot and in rough shape. "Some fella's been asking traders out of Mohawk Ridge if they'd seen her," he said, his eyes narrowing a little. "They claim she's theirs." "She's not claimed," I told him, the words coming low and steady. "She's here with me now." The rider watched me for a long moment, then nodded. I didn't tell them where I saw her. Didn't feel right. I thanked him, then asked if he wanted me to send word. He adjusted in the saddle and shook his head. "Tell them if anyone comes looking, they'll find nothing left standing but the wind." He tipped his hat and turned his horse back the way he'd come. That night I told Tala. She listened without panic, her gaze never leaving mine. "Will they come?" she asked. "Maybe," I said, "but not soon and not ready." She was quiet for a long while before saying, "If I give birth to a child, they'll know I was not taken. They'll know I belonged here." I told her she didn't have to prove anything, but she only answered, "I know. But I will." Later, she undressed without hurry, wearing nothing but the copper ring and her moccasins when she came to my side. She took my hand and placed it over her belly. "I want you to feel it now," she said. I did, my hand still against her as I leaned down to kiss her, slow and certain the way she had kissed me earlier that week. That night, there was no thought of survival or what had been left behind, only what we had chosen to keep. By the middle of April, the last of the deep drifts had melted from the south-facing slope, and the creek behind the cabin ran fast with snowmelt. The air carried the scent of damp pine and raw earth. Each day, Tala's steps had slowed a little, her balance shifting as her belly grew. She never spoke much about it, but her hand found its place over the curve without thought. One morning I came in from clearing a downed limb off the fence to find her sitting on the porch steps, wrapped in the coat I'd first given her. Her hair had slipped loose, dark strands resting against her cheeks. She looked up at me and said, "They're not coming." Her tone was certain, as if she'd settled the matter in her mind. I sat beside her. No, they're not. She glanced toward the door. You still keep your rifle loaded? I nodded. Always. Later that afternoon, I pulled the oilcloth-wrapped bundle from the bottom of my cedar chest. Inside was a silver chain that had belonged to my mother, tucked away so long I'd nearly forgotten it. I handed it to Tala without a word. She turned it over in her hands, the metal catching the light. After a moment, she looked at me. I will wear this the day we say vows. I frowned slightly. We haven't said vows. She lifted her chin. You gave me food and warmth. But you never asked me to be your wife. I told her I didn't think I needed to ask. You don't, she said, her voice softening, but I want you to. That evening, as the sun slid behind the ridge and the sky turned gold, we stood together on the porch. I took her hand and spoke plain. I want you as my wife. Not out of rescue, not out of duty. I want you because you stayed and I stayed, and that's all I'll ever need. Her fingers tightened on mine. Then I am yours. She took the copper ring I'd given her weeks before, placed it in my palm, and slid it back onto her finger while meeting my eyes. Inside the cabin was warm from the fire. She settled beside me on the bed, her belly now firm between us. I rested my hand there the same way I had the first night she'd placed it there herself. She looked up puzzled when I said, You're not what I saved? I kissed her forehead. You're what saved me. Her eyes closed then, not from weariness, but from the kind of peace that lets a person rest without keeping watch. The next days passed in quiet work. We planted the last of the beans, and squash marked each row with carved stakes. Tala still joined me outside, though I took the heavier work. She focused on the garden, arranging stones along the edges, her braid falling forward as she bent to press the soil over each seed. Inside, she baked more often, the smell of fresh bread and coffee filling the cabin in the mornings. It was near dusk one evening when I saw her pause by the table, her head turning slightly toward the sound of hoofbeats in the distance. The basin carried noise far, but these were close enough to set the horses in the corral shifting. She met my eyes, and neither of us spoke. I stepped toward the door, the weight of the rifle familiar in my hands. The hoofbeats carried across the basin, steady and unhurried, but close enough to stir the horses in the corral. I stood in the doorway with the rifle balanced in my hands, watching the shape come clear against the last light of day. A single rider, dark coat, wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He slowed his mount when he saw me, but didn't dismount. You, Sir Ridge, he called, voice carrying over the still air. I gave a short nod. He looked past me toward the cabin before speaking again. Months back, I crossed paths with an Apache woman near the southern canyon. Barefoot, looked like she'd been walking a long time. Some men have been asking about her down near Mohawk Ridge. Claim she's theirs. She isn't claimed, I said, the words leaving my mouth flat and certain. She's here with me now. He studied me for a moment, then said, I didn't tell them where I'd seen her. Didn't sit right. I shifted the rifle in my grip, the weight familiar. Best to keep it that way. The rider's eyes narrowed a little before he nodded. You want me to send a word back? I stepped down off the porch until I was close enough to see the dust on his coat. Tell them if anyone comes looking, they'll find nothing left standing but the wind. He didn't answer, just tipped his hat and turned his horse toward the ridge. I watched until the sound of hooves faded into the hills. Inside, Tala was by the stove turning a loaf of bread out onto the board. She looked up when I came in. Will they come? She asked. Maybe, I said, but not soon and not ready. She set the bread knife down. If I give birth to a child, they'll know I wasn't taken. They'll know I belonged here. I told her she didn't need to prove anything, but she only said, I know. But I will. That night, after the fire had burned low, she undressed slow, her moccasins the only thing left, when she crossed the room to me. She took my hand and placed it against her belly. "Feel it now," she whispered. My palm rested there, steady, the warmth of her skin beneath it. I leaned in and kissed her slow and without rush. For the first time, it wasn't about surviving the cold or keeping the dark out. It was about staying, both of us. In the days that followed, the talk of riders and trouble from the south faded into the rhythm of spring work. We planted the last rows in the garden, set new fence posts where the ground had softened. Tala moved slower now, but still worked beside me, her braid falling forward as she bent to press seed into the soil. One evening after supper, she cleared the table and spread a small scrap of cloth in the center. On it lay the copper ring I had given her, its surface polished bright. She lifted it and held it out. "This time, put it on me because you ask," she said. I met her eyes and slid the ring onto her finger again. She didn't smile wide, but her shoulders eased, and she reached for my hand across the table. That night, we lay with the windows open to the sound of the creek running high. My arm rested across her, my hand just below the rise of her stomach. She covered it with her own and didn't let go until sleep came. The first frost came early that year, glazing the grass along the creek in silver. I was mending a fence rail when Tala stepped out onto the porch, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She called my name softly, and I knew before I reached her that it was time. We saddled the mare slow and steady, wrapping her in blankets before riding the 2 miles into town. The sky was pale with morning, the air sharp enough to make your breath visible. By the time we reached the midwife's house, the sun had climbed over the ridge, throwing gold across the rooftops. Inside the room was warm from the stove. Tala's hand gripped mine as each wave of pain came. I stayed by her side through the long hours, wiping her brow, speaking only when she wanted to hear my voice. Just before nightfall, the cries of a newborn filled the air, strong, clear, and certain. The midwife placed our daughter in Tala's arms. Her tiny face was pink against the folds of the blanket. Tala looked down at her, then up at me, and in that moment, every mile, every hard winter, every shadow from the past seemed worth crossing. We stayed in town for a few days so Tala could rest. Folks stopped by with bread broth and quiet congratulations. No one asked about her past. They only saw a mother, a father, and the child between them. When we finally rode back to the ranch, the basin spread before us, rimmed by snow-tipped peaks. The wind carried the scent of pine and cold earth. I thought about the rider who'd warned me months ago, and about the men who might have come looking. They hadn't found us, and they never would. That night, with the fire low and the baby asleep in a cradle I'd built from cedar, Tala sat beside me. "This is our place now," she said. "No one can take it." I nodded, knowing she was right. The land had tested us, but it had also given us a home, a life, and a family born not from what we were given, but from what we chose. Out here, you learn that justice isn't always written in a ledger or handed down from a judge's bench. Sometimes it's found in the quiet safety of your own walls, in the warmth of a child's breath, in the strength to stand and keep what's yours. And as the snow began to fall outside, I knew we had that. We had enough. If you've walked through your own storms and found a place worth keeping, I hope you hold it close. Share this story with someone who needs reminding. It's not where you start, but where you stand that matters.